We have to be unafraid to make the case that Donald Trump's policies, whether they're tariffs or whether they're other things, are harming you and your family. It is the biggest redistribution of wealth from working class people to the wealthiest people. And this is what I think is the biggest con of Donald Trump, which is the tariffs and Medicaid are going to be borne by working class people. When we decide as a country to pull back health insurance, like, people will die. I know that sounds hyperbolic, but it is actually the case. I do think the fact that the president pardoned the January 6th rioters, insurrectionists, these are the shock troops of an authoritarian kind of government. Let's, throw off the doom and gloom and realize that we are, again, in a, battle for the heart of this country, and that Donald Trump's policies do not represent a majority.
Since taking office, it feels like Donald Trump has made changes to virtually every aspect of our lives, from new tariffs to renaming the Gulf of Mexico. He's done many of these things through what's called an executive order, a term most of us have heard, but few of us really understand. Neera Tanden does. She helped shape President Biden's executive orders, later oversaw all of his domestic policy, and is now president and CEO of the Center for American Progress, a leading policy think tank. Neera explains what an executive order is, how they're meant to be used, and why she believes that Trump's unchecked power may finally be facing real limits. Let's swear into the People's Cabinet, Neera Tanden. Neera Tanden, welcome to the People's Cabinet.
Great to be with you.
So we're all familiar now with the scene in the Oval of the president declaring something with his staff secretary next to him, a role you formerly held, and declaring everything from tariffs to cutting off EV funding to penalties against law firms and universities. I think the same thought is going through a lot of Americans' heads, which is, how is he allowed to do that? And at a higher level, what is an executive order? So as someone who has both done the staff secretary role, you've been domestic policy advisor, and someone who's just been working in policy your entire life, could you explain in layman's terms to listeners what an executive order is?
Yes. So executive orders do many different things, but sort of the basic executive order function is to interpret laws. So it is the way in which the president is interpreting, essentially a legal authority he has been given by the Congress, which people may ask, what does that mean in this context when it doesn't seem very tethered to any laws? And I think it's really important to remember that, our judiciary system still understands what an executive order is, because the president is losing case after case after case. People are bringing temporary restraining orders, which are really sort of emergency actions and very rarely granted. But because judges are recognizing that these executive orders are really do not have they're not lawful. Essentially, these are like lawless acts of the president. The courts are granting temporary restraining orders. And it's like a fascinating thing because, a lot on the right have been saying it's a sign of a run-amok judiciary that they're granting 47 TROs or 55 TROs against President Trump, but really it's a sign of the lawlessness of this administration that judges feel the need to rein in the administration, and that's a function at its base of the president issuing a range of executive orders that are fundamentally press releases, maybe written by Stephen Miller, instead of traditional executive orders that function. They are the basic function of them is to direct an interpretation of a statute or a presidential power, and how that power should be interpreted by the rest of the government.
And you used an acronym about what judges issue. I want to make sure people understand what it was.
Yes, temporary restraining orders, TROs. So a temporary restraining order, as I said, is it's a kind of, there's a very high bar for judges to issue a temporary restraining order against any kind of action by the government. And the reason why it's high is because usually the courts have to wait till there's a harm to someone to really litigate the case. It's only when it's really lawless that courts will issue a temporary restraining order. Normal courts will issue a temporary restraining order. And what we've seen in the case, like you mentioned, there was a kind of press release EO targeting these particular law firms. There was very little legal basis for anything happening underlying this EO. And that's why the courts have actually, every kind of judge, a Trump judge, a Bush judge, a Biden judge, an Obama judge issued temporary restraining orders in individual cases being brought by the law firms targeted.
And do you have an example of, and this can be under Trump, it can be under President Biden, of an executive order that you felt fell well within the bounds of the law, and how it compares to maybe one you find most egregious now under Trump?
Well, we had executive orders. There are executive orders under President Biden and President Obama that outlined, how we would interpret a statute. Or a good example here would be on federal contracting. There's something called high road contracting. So both President Obama and President Biden issued executive orders saying that people who are doing work with the government should not be abusive employers. And they were interpreting a statute that gives the president the power to kind of have broad parameters around contractors. And they had interpretations of the requirements of the law that said, that essentially the contractors had to be effective and efficient. And they interpreted that statute to say, if you're abusing employees, you're not an effective or an effective contractor. So that's a way in which you're interpreting language in a statute. And perhaps it's an expansive interpretation, but it is language in a statute that gives the president the power to say how he's interpreting that statute, or he or she, but in that case, he. So that is very different from, say, an executive order that says a particular law firm is not permitted to actually practice in front of any federal agencies, essentially because the president doesn't like the law firm. Or, and this is like kind of so extraordinary. It's like, for my very technical term, it's wackadoodle. You have an executive order that's targeting two individuals, Miles Taylor and Krebs. And those cases are ones where it's just like, it's just, some version of being insane or inane to think that the administration can really just target two individuals for, basically under threat of Justice Department attack. And I think that the thing that's really important in this moment, I think, is, I think that Donald Trump uses he basically uses fear as an asymmetric weapon. And these EOs are obviously lawless, but, he's trying to scare people, right? So he issues these EOs, and he basically waits for the courts to stop him, and he will go as far as he can. But the truth of it is that even when the courts, basically stop him weeks, months later, he scared the living daylights out of a lot of people. And it really is an intimidation tactic. And so what I like to tell people is, doom and gloom is like the worst you can do here. Like, fear is a terrible, terrible thing to live with. We have to see through that fear. What he is doing is lawless. We should understand it is lawless. And, fear is the mind killer, as they say in Dune. And we cannot let him scare us into cowering or pre-obeying, we cannot allow him to use the power of the fear to make us intimidated.
Well, to the point of fear, I think a lot of people, when they see this, are just wondering what Congress is doing right now, right? Because
Nothing.
because look, I think there's been plenty of times in which the parties own both houses, have the majority in both houses, and there's a Democratic or Republican president of the same party. Congress was created, or the Congress by the Constitution is supposed to be a check and balance on the executive branch. And so I know I think there's 147 or so executive orders so far in the Trump administration. Are there some that come to mind, or one in particular that comes to mind where you said this is something that Congress should be intervening and they're not? And is it just out of fear of retribution? I mean, I'm just curious. You've seen a lot of different houses. You've seen a lot of elected officials. And I think a lot of people are just confused. Why isn't Congress more vocal or taking more action right now? Even those on the Republican side who believe in the role of Congress being a check on the executive.
So, first of all, I mean, we talked about some of the most egregious EOs, but I think the area where it's kind of most surprising Congress hasn't done anything is the overly expansive definition of national security threat that the president is using, President Trump is using on the tariffs. Now, these tariffs are, again, 145% tariff on China is it's kind of an insane, crazy pants policy, for another very technical term. It's just a very egregious use of that power, and that is an area where the president is essentially creating a national sales tax. It's a varied national sales tax, but it is a national sales tax nonetheless. And Congress, in any normal time, would try to take that authority back because they should have the power under the Constitution to issue taxes like that. So that's a clear area where there should be congressional action. I think the big difference between today and 8 years ago is really just this issue that you've put your finger on, which is where are the Republicans in Congress who just to defend their own authority. And I think there's a combination of things that are happening here. I think ranging from Elon Musk controlling Twitter and really controlling a giant communication vehicle to attack people that disagree with the administration, particularly Republicans. He's also spending a lot of money in elections. He has hundreds of millions of dollars. He spent a lot of money in Wisconsin. It didn't work, but he has a lot of money to spend in Republican primaries, which he's threatened to do. And then I will say, and I'm not trying to get conspiratorial, but I do think the fact that the president pardoned the January 6th rioters, insurrectionists, these are the, shock troops of an authoritarian kind of government. And so I think that has sent a message of fear to people. Now, the thing for all of us to do is to create the cross pressure on Republicans so that they have to have a choice. Maybe it's a choice between their primary and their general election, but they have to really understand that they are going to lose their seats if they continue on a path where they offer no checks. But I'll just briefly say we have some moments of optimism here. The president pulled his nomination for the U.S. attorney from the District of Columbia. Now that guy was like a known white nationalist. You'd think that wouldn't be like a hard choice, but it is one of the first cases of him really pulling down a nominee because of pressure from the opposition. And, that was a broad coalition of people concerned about anti-Semitism, people concerned about white nationalism, people concerned about just abuse of power. And, he did seem to just be dramatically abusing the power of being a U.S. attorney. But that nomination getting pulled, and, I think we are beginning to see some cracks in the armor. The fact that, in the House, it's seemingly hard. They're going to go through a lot of iterations. They probably will not cut $880 billion out of Medicaid. It might be less. Our advocacy matters.
And you touched on Medicaid, and it's something obviously you're an expert on. You were one of the architects of the ACA back in the day. You've continued to be involved deeply in healthcare policy. I just want to make sure people understand what's at stake with Medicaid, because I think obviously a lot of Americans are on Medicaid, but there's a lot of people who kind of have this nebulous idea that it's good to help people who need healthcare who can't afford it, but I'm not sure they quite understand the next layer or two. And so could you just explain what is at stake and what you see as maybe what the fight might be in the horizon on Medicaid?
Yeah. So Medicaid is a program that provides health care to people. It differs by state, but it's fundamentally a program that offers, health care to the biggest constituency is actually children. 90% of people on Medicaid are either working or in training. There's this whole thing about how there's all these single adults just sitting around not working or anything. That is just not the picture of Medicaid. Medicaid is helping basically mostly working people who are not getting health insurance through their employer. People who are struggling to make ends meet. They have access to a doctor if they have asthma or cancer screenings only through the Medicaid program. And if they lose the Medicaid program, they will definitely not have health insurance. So we've done a lot of work on what this means. Obviously, it means millions of people will lose health insurance. The largest number of people who would lose health insurance would be children. It means state budgets would be under assault, but it really also means we would have more people die because health insurance actually does keep people alive. When I was fighting on the ACA, I was at a rally and this man came up to me and this man had never had health insurance in his whole life. I believe he actually got health insurance from Medicaid expansion. He was a truck driver. He got health insurance from Medicaid expansion and for the first time went to a doctor and he found out that he needed bypass heart surgery. And so he, at this rally, showed me his scar because he basically said, if I didn't have health insurance, I would never have gone to the doctor and I would have just one day had a heart attack. So that's what's at stake when we decide as a country to pull back health insurance. People will die. I know that sounds hyperbolic, but it is actually the case. And what's crazy about this entire debate is really they are trying to take money out of Medicaid and healthcare for working class people in order to pay for a massive tax cut, for the wealthiest people in America, including billionaires. And so that is the lion's share of the tax cut is really going to help the wealthiest people in the country. So it is the biggest redistribution of wealth from working class people to the wealthiest people. And this is what I think is the biggest con of Donald Trump, which is the tariffs and Medicaid are going to be borne by working class people. They are going to pay for these policies, and the people who are they supposed to benefit are the wealthiest among us. And that is something that we, as people who oppose these policies, have to be really clear about.
And what will happen to the kids? They will just
Yeah.
have no health insurance and they're just on their own. Will some states try to intervene? I mean, I'm just trying to understand what would a Republican strategist tell you when you push back and you say, listen, children are going to lose their health insurance?
They'll say things like, look, we're trying to just do work requirements. So we want people to work in Medicaid. And look, that sounds good. And we're after Medicaid fraud. And that looks, that might sound good. But really what they're doing, this is a smokescreen. So Arkansas enacted work requirements. 40% of people lost Medicaid coverage. And really why? Because the work requirements were just a paperwork process to drive people off the rolls. And lots of parents got lost coverage. And because they lost coverage, their kids lost coverage. So, I know it sounds like it's so crazy that anyone would really want to do this. And that's why they're trying to say things like, oh, we really just want people on Medicaid to work. But of course, people are working already. And I think, again, I know it sounds nuts that people would like to drive people off their health care. But, they think that this is coming from an extreme right position that we shouldn't have people, the government shouldn't pay for health care. People should do this stuff on their own. And that's why, but that's also why it's important for us to fight tooth and nail against it and demonstrate to the country, like we did in the ACA, that, the decision point here is whether we as a country think we are wealthy enough to actually ensure that every kid in America has health insurance. And I am betting that the answer is yes.
So you talked about Republican messaging and Elon Musk being behind the machine. How do Democrats combat that in this environment, both from a apparatus of what Musk controls, but then also what kind of messaging Democrats should be using at this stage?
Yeah, I mean, I think we should be really focused on actual facts. And, I'm not as negative on, I'm not as bleak as some people are about the prospects for the, social media system and all of those problems. I think actually social media is pretty anti-incumbent, pretty anti-institutional. And right now, Donald Trump is the incumbent. Donald Trump is the person who is on his own executing a tariff policy that is driving costs up and that may make it impossible for you to find your dolls for your children, right? So he is the actor that is behind cutting Medicaid for people. It's to finance a giant tax cut. So I think we just have to be clear and focused on the actual impact of what he's doing and be clear that this is a very different moment than it was 3 or 4 months ago. Donald Trump's approval ratings have really come down. He's in the low 40s, maybe the high 30s. And, a lot of people ask, why does that matter? That matters because it's not like I think that will affect him, but it affects other Republicans. And you see some cracks develop. And then also it affects institutions that may think about cowering or pre-obeying because he doesn't have a majority of the country behind him. He thought attacking Harvard would be one of his easiest fights, right? But it turns out actually, a majority of the country does not think that the government should be dictating what a school teaches or who they accept. It's a private entity. So my view of this is we have to be unafraid to make the case that Donald Trump's policies, whether they're tariffs or whether they're other things, are harming you and your family.
And what's the policy and messaging vision that we should lead with as Democrats? What's the alternate vision we should depict?
Well, I think on issue after issue, we do have to offer an alternative, as you said. I fundamentally think that it's a great thing that the country is actually rejecting the President Trump's policies on, pulling people off the streets and deporting them to El Salvador and gulags. I think it's a great thing that the American people recognize that due process is actually something that protects your civil liberties, your civil rights, as well as everyone else's. So I think that's really important. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that people want solutions. And as Democrats, we all should believe in solutions for people. So we have to offer our own ideas of, what we would do on a complicated issue like immigration. How would we solve for both the border, but also expand legal immigration because that's also a problem in our country? How would we do both of those things? How would we reform our government to work better for consumers? DOGE is a smokescreen for cuts, but actually we could make this government work a lot better for seniors, for people who need benefits. And I think I'm excited about the fact that CAP will be putting out ideas in this space. And fundamentally, how do we have an economic program, or what is our economic program where we're committed to ensuring, not just fairness is important, but opportunity, growth, success for families. I'm really taken by the fact that some of the biggest erosion and support for Democrats this cycle was amongst immigrant communities, people, recent arrivals who are voting. And we have to have a message of opportunity and, success for those families. And, but I think we also have a lot of opportunity in the sense that Trump's policies are making things more expensive, weighing them down. They are much more pessimistic than they used to be. And that's an opening. But it's an opening that we can only take advantage of if we actually offer a choice. Here are two different visions of change, Trump's wrecking ball or our positive vision.
And is there a specific – I know there's so many that CAP will be rolling out and talking about, but is there one in particular that comes to mind when you say this is one that I think that Democrats should really be going out with that really resonate with people?
Well, we're going to have a variety of ideas. It's hard to pick amongst my children here, but on how to improve our schools, how to ensure, how to reduce costs for housing, how to address the middle class squeeze of high costs like housing, healthcare costs, and how to address issues of public safety. We're going to put out a lot of ideas because we believe we need to offer an alternative, not just opposition. That's kind of one of our taglines, almost. But I also think that, I think political leaders will emerge who will take, our ideas, I hope, but some selection of our ideas and really pressure test them with the country. But we want to have a whole, agenda that addresses, the real problems people face in their lives. And I think, again, as Democrats, it's really important for us to do that because if we believe in government, we have to make sure it works well and addresses people's needs wherever they are.
My last question to you is, there's a lot of people who are feeling very hopeless with what's going on. They turn on the TV, they're overwhelmed by the news. They're distressed with what they see as Trump just unchecked power. You've given us a lot to think about today, but if there are people who are listening right now who say, I want to go to the people, the neighbors that I know, re-engage them in what the Democratic Party stands for, or even talk to MAGA voters who are now expressing some regret, what's your message to them to get people involved again?
Well, first I'd say the most important thing for any country that faces any kind of authoritarian threat is to build a united front. So I think it's important to reach out to all Americans, MAGA supporters, people who voted for Trump that might regret their vote, normal-based Democrats. And for each one, try to persuade them about what's wrong with the direction of our country under this president. So if you live in a state where there's a Republican member or you have friends in a family, you have friends or family in a place that has a Republican House member, this is the time to make the call and say you do not want Medicaid slashed. If you're in a Republican state or a state with a Republican senator, make a call. The whole strategy of the other side is to make us feel like their actions are inevitable. This is the whole strategy. They're going to pass this bill. It's going to do this thing no matter what you do. That is a strategy to demobilize us. And it's really crucial that we remember that these are all in the House. They are all up in 2 years. Senators like Tom Tillis in North Carolina is up in 2 years. And it's vital that they are held accountable now. And, again, we do see cracks. There's opportunities here. So let's, throw off the doom and gloom and realize that we are, again, in a, battle for the heart of this country and that Donald Trump's policies do not represent a majority. They represent a hard right minority. And I think increasingly some people, may have who voted for him are recognizing that, and that's the opportunity for us.
Neera Tanden, thank you for coming on the People's Cabinet.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the People's Cabinet. If you did, please like, subscribe, ring that bell, and put in the comments below who else you'd like to see sworn in. And stay tuned for new episodes every Tuesday. Let's go.